It was the kind of night that could kill a person. Cheyenne, Wyoming. Winter of 1887. The snow fell sideways, not downswept by winds sharp enough to cut through wool and bone. The sky was low and angry, and even the cattle had gone quiet. But in the middle of that storm, at the town's lonesome train station, sat a woman alone on a wooden bench, bundled in a threadbare shawl, her breath puffing out in small, desperate clouds. Her name was Elizabeth Montgomery, but she'd long stopped introducing herself that way. These days she just went by Libby, a nurse without a hospital, a woman without a home, a heart full of dreams now frozen stiff like the air around her. Back in Philadelphia, Libby had been a skilled nurse at one of the city's charity hospitals. She delivered babies, stitched wounds, even comforted the dying with hands steady and voice calm. But all of that ended the day she said no to the wrong man, a doctor who believed his title gave him the right to take what he wanted. Libby defended herself with a bedpan and broke his nose. He responded with lies. And in that version of the story, the one written by powerful men, Libby was labeled unstable, dangerous, unfit. No hospital in the East would touch her after that. So she did the only thing a woman with nothing left to lose could do. She left. Took what little money she had, bought a one-way ticket west, and set out toward the unknown. Mining towns, frontier. Outposts, places where a person's past mattered less than what they could do with their hands. But her money ran out in Cheyenne. The boarding house turned her away. And now she sat at the train station in the dead of night, waiting for a train that might not come until morning, if the storm didn't bury the tracks first. Beside her sat her last possession of real value, a worn leather medical bag. Inside were the tools of her trade: scissors, gauze, vials of quinine and laudanum, along with her nursing certificates and a faded photograph of her parents. She had $3 to her name, and not a single soul in Wyoming who knew she existed. That's when she heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of horse hooves on frozen earth. She looked up through the swirling snow and saw a figure approaching, tall, broad, wrapped in a heavy coat, and mounted on a black stallion that looked like it belonged in a cavalry parade. The man rode with purpose, but not in a rush. When he reached the hitching post, he dismounted with quiet ease and stepped into the station, bringing a flurry of snow with him. "Evenin', miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice had a southern drawl, just enough to sound warm, like coffee with molasses. "Mighty cold night to be sittin' here alone." Libby tried to speak, but her jaw was locked. From the cold, she managed a nod. The man studied her, noticed the bag, the fine but worn clothes, the proud posture despite her obvious hardship. "Name's Jack Thornton," he said, removing his gloves. "I own the Double T Ranch about 20 miles north. Was in town on business. Saw you sitting here through the window." He didn't ask what she was doing alone. He didn't question her, just noticed. And that, perhaps, was the moment everything changed. When she finally managed to say, "Nurse Elizabeth Montgomery." From Philadelphia, Jack's eyebrows lifted. A trained nurse was rarer than gold in Wyoming territory. Most towns were lucky if their barber could pull a tooth without killing a man. "You'll freeze to death if you stay here," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "This station isn't heated, and the storm's just getting worse. Please, let me get you somewhere warm." Libby hesitated. She'd learned not to trust men easily, especially men who seemed too kind, too ready to help. But something about Jack Thornton didn't feel dangerous. There was strength, yes, but it was quiet, steady, and she was so very tired of being strong alone. "I don't have money for a hotel," she whispered. "That's not your concern right now," Jack replied, already shrugging off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it was startling. It smelled like leather, pine soap, and something else, something reassuring. "Getting you warm and fed comes first. We'll sort out the rest later." When she couldn't stand, he lifted her effortlessly gentle, not possessive, and carried her across the street to the Cattleman's Hotel, the finest place in town. Heads turned. The clerk scrambled. Blankets and hot food were summoned like an emergency brigade. Libby barely registered it all. Her mind floated somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. But Jack stayed, poured her coffee, sat beside her. Never once asked what she could give him in return. In a world that had tried to break her down, Jack Thornton offered something she hadn't felt in months: not safety, not charity, dignity. Some stories begin with a grand gesture, others with fireworks or first kisses. But this one began with a storm and a man who chose not to walk past a freezing stranger. In a territory where survival was a daily battle and women were often seen as either fragile or fallen, Jack Thornton saw a third option: a capable woman in need of a new beginning. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change the course of history. By the time they reached the Cattleman's Hotel, Libby could barely feel her feet. Snow clung to her skirt, her hands were stiff from the cold, and every step felt like it might be her last. But Jack never let her fall. He carried her inside, as if she weighed nothing, past curious onlookers and whispering guests, straight to the front desk where he demanded the best room, hot food, blankets, and a doctor if one could be found. There was something about the way he moved, calm and focused, that made Libby trust him, even if her instincts had long been trained not to. The room they gave her was warm, lined with thick carpets and a fireplace that Jack lit himself. When the coffee arrived, he poured it for her with surprisingly gentle hands. She watched him in silence, still wrapped in the coat he had given her, its warmth now soaked through with comfort more than heat. He didn't ask questions at first, just let her breathe. Let her thaw. It was the first time in months she didn't feel like she had to defend her own existence. Eventually, when her fingers had stopped shaking, she told him. Not everything, but enough. About Philadelphia, about the hospital, about the doctor who crossed a line and the punishment that came. Not to him, but to her. She'd fought back, and for that, she was cast out. It was the kind of story far too many women knew, especially in a time when reputation meant everything and power meant silence. Jack listened, really listened. And when she finished, he didn't respond with pity or polite outrage. He simply sighed, "Good for you. I hope it broke more than his nose." It made her smile just a little. The first time she'd smiled in months. Maybe it was the coffee or the fire or the fact that this stranger treated her like a human being. But for the first time since leaving the East, Libby felt seen. Not as a victim, not as a problem, but as someone with something valuable to offer. That's when Jack surprised her again. He leaned back in his chair, looked at her with steady eyes and said, "I don't have a doctor on my ranch. 60 men, sometimes more during roundup, and I've lost good men just because there was no one to tend them when they fell. I've been searching for a healer." I didn't expect her to show up freezing in a train station, but here you are. He paused, like he wanted to make sure she understood. "I'm offering you a job, Miss Montgomery, a real one. As the official nurse at the Double T Ranch. Good pay, a warm cabin, your own space, medical supplies, everything you need." Libby blinked. Of all the things she expected that night, a job offer wasn't one of them. Especially not from a man like Jack Thornton, wealthy, respected, the kind of man who probably had no shortage of people lining up to work for him. She hesitated, of course. Who wouldn't? The West was rough. And even now, part of her wondered if this offer came with strings. But Jack was quick to clarify. "I'm not asking anything of you except your skill and your time. You'd be paid for honest work, no expectations beyond that. If anything ever happens between us, it'll be because we both choose it, not because you feel obligated." That honesty, so rare and so plain, landed harder than any romantic declaration. It was exactly what she needed to hear. Not a rescue, not a savior, just an opportunity. The kind that respected her boundaries, her pride, and her professional worth. She looked at him then, really looked. Jack Thornton wasn't like the men she'd known in the East. He was rougher on the edges, yes. But there was a strength in him that had nothing to do with wealth. It was the kind of strength that carried people through storms, literally and figuratively. And in that moment, Libby realized she didn't have to keep running. She didn't have to keep proving her worth to people who'd already decided she had none. "I'll try it," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "But if it doesn't work out, I'll move on. No hard feelings." Jack's smile stretched slowly, like the sun rising after a long night. "Fair enough. Welcome to the Double T, Nurse Montgomery." That was how it began, not with grand promises or sweeping romance, but with mutual respect. A job offered, a purpose returned, and a spark that neither of them dared name just yet. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it waits quietly in the warmth of a borrowed coat and the kindness of a stranger who asks for nothing in return. And that night, as Libby sat beside the fire, sipping coffee and watching the snow ease outside her window, she allowed herself something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope, not just for survival, but for something more, something better, something that, just maybe, was already beginning. The road to the Double T Ranch took nearly 3 hours by horseback. Snow still blanketed the Wyoming hills, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape so vast, so quiet, it felt like the world had paused just long enough for something new to begin. Jack rode ahead, pointing out creeks and cottonwood groves, speaking with the easy confidence of a man who knew the land like he knew the lines in his own hands. Beside him, Libby rode in silence, wrapped in a new coat, warm boots, and the steady disbelief that she was really here. Not as a stranger passing through, but as someone needed, someone wanted. When they crested the final hill, Jack reined in his horse and nodded toward the valley below. "There she is," he said with quiet pride. The Double T spread out like a small town tucked between mountains, bunkhouses, stables, smoke curling from chimneys, the main lodge built from solid logs and stone. It was honest, rugged, alive, and for the first time in years, Libby felt like she was arriving, not just escaping. He led her to a small cabin, set a little apart from the main house. "This one's yours," he said, opening the door. Inside, the fire was already lit, the room warm and smelling faintly of cedar. There was a bed with clean linens, a small kitchen stocked with supplies, and a wooden desk positioned by the window, overlooking the pastures. It wasn't grand. It was perfect. But what caught her breath wasn't the cabin. It was the door Jack opened next to side room she hadn't noticed. Inside was a fully stocked medical space, examination table, cabinets, surgical tools, bottles of medicine, even fresh bandages. She stepped in like someone entering a chapel. "This must have cost a fortune," she whispered, running her fingers over the polished instruments. "A good nurse is worth a fortune," Jack said simply. "Besides, I ordered it all months ago. Just been waiting for someone to use it." And that's when Libby understood something profound. She wasn't being pitied. She wasn't a project. She was prepared for. Jack hadn't just saved her from a cold night in Cheyenne. He'd made room for her, long before he knew her name. The work began almost immediately. One cowboy had a gash on his hand from barbed wire. Another had a twisted ankle from a fall in the corral. A third came limping in after a horse stepped on his foot. They all arrived with the same look, skeptical curiosity. What could a woman from Philadelphia know about life on a cattle ranch? But it didn't take long for skepticism to fade. Libby moved with calm precision, cleaning wounds, resetting joints, giving instructions with quiet authority. She didn't just treat injuries, she taught. Showed the men how to bandage properly, when to rest, what signs to watch for in infection. She wasn't there to be decorative. She was there to work. And work she did. Over the next few weeks, her reputation grew faster than any wild tale in a saloon. They began calling her Doc Libby, even though she reminded them she was a nurse. They trusted her judgment more than their own pain, brought her their bruises and breaks without hesitation, and even started asking for advice that had nothing to do with medicine. She became a fixture at the ranch, not just for her skills, but for the way she treated everyone, from the seasoned foreman to the youngest stable hand, with the same level of care. But the respect didn't come just from what she did. It came from what she didn't do. She didn't complain when the nights were long, didn't flinch at blood or broken bones, didn't ask for praise. She simply showed up, again and again, proving herself not with words, but with steady hands and a heart that hadn't forgotten why she became a nurse in the first place. For women in the late 1800s, especially in the West, gaining respect was rarely about titles. It was about endurance. You didn't ask to be taken seriously. You earned it with every sunrise, every saddle sore, every life saved. Libby Montgomery didn't need anyone to give her value. She demonstrated it over and over until even the most hardened cowboy couldn't deny she belonged, and Jack watched it all quietly from the sidelines. He never hovered, never interfered, but he noticed the way she stayed up late to tend a fever, the way she taught one of the younger boys to read using anatomy charts, the way she walked this rough, wild land as though she had always known it was hers to claim. What started as an act of kindness on a freezing night had grown into something deeper, something neither of them said aloud, because they both understood that real partnerships, the kind built to last, don't begin with declarations. They begin with work, with trust, with showing up every day, especially when it's hard. And in that quiet cabin, tucked beside the hills of Wyoming, Libby had found what she thought she'd lost forever. Not just a place to live, but a place to matter. A life shaped by her own hands, in a land that respected what those hands could do. She hadn't just survived the storm. She'd ridden straight into her future. Out on the Wyoming range, the days were long, but the nights had a kind of hush to them. After the horses were stabled, after the lanterns dimmed and the bunkhouse quieted, a different rhythm settled over the Double T Ranch. It was in that quiet where something unexpected began to grow, not in a burst of passion, but slowly, like spring thaw breaking through winter frost. Most evenings, after her rounds were done and the fire in her cabin crackled low, Libby would find Jack on her porch, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate, one for her, one for him. No words exchanged at first, just that quiet understanding that some things don't need an invitation. They'd sit side by side, listening to the wind whisper through the cottonwoods, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't, about cattle and weather, about books she missed reading and the business side of running a ranch, about the ache of starting over and the strange beauty of building something new with your own 2 hands. These weren't the kinds of conversations that fill romance novels. They weren't laced with flowery speeches or stolen glances. They were honest, safe, and for Libby, they were something she hadn't known she'd needed, a space where she could simply be. One night, as the moon hung full over the hills and a coyote cried somewhere in the distance, Jack got quiet. He turned the mug in his hands, staring into the steam like it might hold something he couldn't say outright. And then, gently, he told her about Rebecca. "She was my wife," he said, voice low. "We married young. Childhood sweethearts back in Texas. She was kind, gentle. Liked to press wildflowers into books and sing to the horses. Fever took her 3 years ago." Libby didn't speak. She didn't need to. Some losses were too sacred to fill with words. "I thought that was it for me," Jack continued. "That kind of pain, it doesn't leave a lot of room for second chances. And I never expected to feel anything again, let alone this." He looked at her then, not searching, not hoping. Just seeing her, all of her. Libby felt her breath catch, because somewhere in all those nights, somewhere between mending broken bones and quiet porch talks, her heart had started to heal too. She hadn't even realized it. But now with Jack looking at her like that, as if she were something solid in his storm, she couldn't pretend anymore that this was just companionship. "It's not just respect," she said finally, "or gratitude. I feel it too." Jack didn't rush toward her, didn't reach for her hand or kiss her under the stars. He simply nodded, like he'd known all along, and was just waiting until she knew it too. A few weeks passed. Work continued. Days bled into nights. But now, their conversations carried a quiet current beneath the words, something unnamed, but no longer hidden. And then, one late evening in early spring, Jack showed up with something different in his hands. It wasn't hot chocolate this time. It was a small box, velvet wrapped, tucked carefully in his coat. "I've thought a lot about how to say this," he began. "And maybe there's no perfect way. So I'm just going to say it plain." He held out the box but didn't open it yet. "I want to spend my life with you, Libby. Not because I saved you from the cold. Not because I need a nurse on the ranch. But because I've never met a woman like you. Strong enough to start over. Brave enough to speak the truth. Kind enough to heal people who don't always know how to ask for help." Then, he opened the box. Inside was a simple gold band. No diamonds, no flourishes. Just something real, honest, like everything else about him. "I know it's fast," he said. "I know it's complicated. But I also know I don't want to go another day wondering if I might lose the chance to build a life with you." Libby didn't answer right away. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, looking not at the ring, but at the man in front of her. A man who had offered her not just warmth, not just work, but a partnership, not a rescue, a future. "You don't need to answer now," Jack said softly. "Just promise you'll think about it." And she did. She promised. But in her heart, Libby already knew. She had come west looking for survival. What she found was purpose, respect, and now perhaps love. Real love. The kind that comes not from grand gestures or perfect timing, but from showing up, night after night, mug after mug, word after word, until two hearts, both bruised and cautious, realized they were never meant to stand alone. That night, the wind shifted, and something new took root beneath the Wyoming stars. There's something about a western summer wedding that feels like it was written straight out of a legend. Wide blue skies, sun-warmed grass stretching for miles, and the hush that falls over a hard-working land when something truly special is about to begin. And in June of 1888, the Double T Ranch became the setting for a wedding that folks would talk about for decades, maybe because of who was getting married, or maybe because of everything they'd survived just to get there. Libby Montgomery had never imagined herself walking down an aisle again, not after Philadelphia, not after everything she'd endured, but Wyoming had changed her, not softened her, no. It had revealed her strength in a different way. Out here, grit and grace could live side by side. And the man waiting for her at the altar? He didn't want to tame her. He simply wanted to stand beside her. Jack Thornton wasn't the kind of man who made a show of things, but for her, he didn't hold back. The entire ranch was swept up in preparations. Cowboys strung up lanterns between the corral posts. Martha, Cookie's wife, filled baskets with wildflowers gathered from the nearby hills. Even the horses seemed to sense something sacred was happening. And in a way, it was. The dress came all the way from San Francisco ivory silk, simple in design, but so soft it caught the breeze like it had been stitched from the sky itself. Libby had hesitated when she saw it, unsure if something so fine still belonged to the girl she used to be. But when she stepped into it that morning, standing in the quiet of her cabin with Martha helping pin up her hair, she didn't see a girl trying to prove her worth anymore. She saw a woman who had earned every bit of light in her life. Outside, the guests had gathered. Not just the ranch hands, though they were all there in their Sunday best, but folks from neighboring ranches, townspeople from Cheyenne, and even a few of Jack's business partners from Denver who had ridden days just to be part of the moment. The Double T had never seen such a crowd. And yet, despite the scale, it felt intimate, honest, like the land itself was bearing witness. Instead of a church, they'd chosen the front porch of the main house as their altar facing west. Of course, because that's where both of their stories had found redemption. Tom Bradley, the longtime foreman, stepped in as the one to walk Libby down the aisle. He'd lost his own daughter years ago and told her, with mist in his eyes, it'd be my honor. The music was nothing more than a fiddle and harmonica. But when Libby stepped out, sunlight catching in her hair, the whole crowd fell silent. Jack stood waiting, dressed in black, his usual confidence tempered with emotion. It was the first time anyone had seen him look nervous. But when their eyes met, the tension melted. There were no second thoughts between them, just gratitude. And love. The ceremony was simple, vows spoken from the heart. Promises made not just for better days, but for the hard ones too. To have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. They didn't say those words lightly. They'd already lived them in their own way. And when the preacher said, "You may now kiss the bride," Jack did just that, with a tenderness that made the Cowboys whistle and cheer, though more than one had to turn away and blink back tears. But the moment that stayed with everyone came later when young Danny stood up to make a toast. The same boy Libby had saved after a near-fatal trampling. He was still healing, still a little pale, but his voice was steady as he lifted his glass of lemonade and said, "To Mrs. Thornton, the woman who saved my life and gave our boss the reason to smile again. May your love story remind the rest of us that second chances are worth chasing." There wasn't a dry eye on the ranch after that. The feast that followed could have fed a small army roast beef, trout, vegetables from the garden, and a wedding cake so tall it had to be delivered from Denver in 3 separate crates. There was dancing under the stars, laughter echoing across the fields, and the kind of joy that settles into your bones and stays there. But for Jack and Libby, the best part came after the crowd had thinned, when they stood on the porch of their new home, looking out over the land they'd share, hand in hand. "Well, Mrs. Thornton," Jack said with a grin that still made her stomach flutter, "how does it feel to be married?" Libby leaned her head against his shoulder and answered quietly, "It feels like coming home." And maybe that's what made this wedding different. It wasn't about the dress or the crowd or even the kiss. It was about the journey. 2 people who had been broken in different ways, finding in each other not rescue, but recognition. A partner who saw the best in them, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. That June day, beneath the endless Wyoming sky, Jack and Libby didn't just get married. They became a promise made visible, a living, breathing testament to what love can be when it's earned, when it's equal, and when it shows up after the storm. Marriage, for most folks in the Wyoming Territory, was about survival. 2 people joining forces to keep a roof overhead, raise a family, maybe grow a patch of land. But for Jack and Libby Thornton, it became something more, a partnership that turned into a force of change, not just for their own lives, but for an entire region still learning how to define itself. From the very start, their marriage didn't fit the mold. Libby wasn't content to just be the rancher's wife, and Jack never asked her to be. Instead, they ran the Double T Ranch side by side, not just in the emotional sense, but in the literal day-to-day grind of it all. Libby tended injuries and illness among the ranch hands, but she also helped run payroll, sat in on livestock deals, and mapped out grazing strategies with the foreman like she'd been born into cattle country. Jack often said she had a better head for numbers than he did, and he meant it. But where Libby truly left her mark was in the field she'd been called to long before the West ever knew her name: medicine. It started small. A snakebite treated. A baby delivered during a storm. Word traveled faster than tumbleweeds, and soon, people were writing days just to find Nurse Libby. One spring, after a particularly brutal outbreak of cholera in a nearby mining camp, Libby realized something. This land didn't just need a nurse, it needed a hospital. And she wasn't the type to wait for permission. With Jack's unwavering support, and yes, more than a few of his business connections, Libby raised the funds to build Wyoming's first fully operational medical facility. It wasn't just 4 walls and a bed. It had a surgical room, maternity ward, and even a small classroom in the back. Because Libby wasn't just healing the sick. She was building a future one where women could be trained, certified, and respected for their medical knowledge. The Thornton School of Nursing opened its doors just 1 year later. Its first graduating class was made up of 6 young women, all local ranch daughters who had never imagined they could be anything more than wives and mothers. Libby gave them something revolutionary: choice. And with each graduating class, her legacy grew. Meanwhile, Jack had taken on a new kind of responsibility. Folks in town had long looked to him as a leader: his success, his fairness, the way. He treated people from all walks of life with the same respect. So it was no surprise when he was elected to represent their interests in the territorial legislature. He wasn't a politician by nature, but he was a man of vision, and that vision? It didn't stop at cattle. Jack used his seat to push for infrastructure, clean water, better education, and medical access across the territory. He lobbied for roads to connect remote communities and brought in investment for rail lines and telegraph stations. And when no one else stepped up to organize the expansion of local housing and schools, Jack didn't just fund it, he founded an entire town. They named it Thornton. It started as a small cluster of buildings just south of the Double Tia. General store, schoolhouse, church, and a few homes for ranch families. But within 5 years, it had grown into a true community. And at the heart of it, Libby's hospital. The only place for miles where a woman in labor, a child with fever, or a ranch hand with a broken leg could receive professional care. What made their partnership so powerful wasn't just ambition. It was how seamlessly their roles blended. Where Jack built roads, Libby built reasons to travel them. Where he raised buildings, she filled them with purpose. They weren't fighting for power, they were pulling in the same direction. And together, they made each other better. Libby never stopped practicing. Even with 3 young children and a growing public profile, she kept her hands steady and her heart open. She treated each patient wealthy investor or dusty cowboy with the same calm confidence that had saved a life on a bunkhouse table years before. And Jack? He never once expected her to shrink to fit anyone's idea of a wife. In fact, he made sure the world saw her clearly, introducing her at business meetings as his partner in every sense. Their marriage became more than a union. It became a symbol. Proof that the West wasn't just a land for rugged men and silent women, but a place where 2 strong souls could build something together, something lasting. When folks talk about the American dream, they usually imagine money or fame. But maybe Jack and Libby redefined it into something quieter, deeper, a life of meaning, a town that grew from their grit, a hospital that bore witness to their compassion, and a love that never asked either of them to be anything less than whole. Because when love is rooted in respect, in shared purpose and patience, it doesn't just survive. It shapes history. By the spring of 1889, Libby Thornton had made a name for herself across the Wyoming Territory, not just as a nurse, not just as Jack's wife, but as a woman who had turned hardship into healing. The hospital she founded was saving lives. Her nursing school was training the next generation of frontier women to do what she once did alone. And the town of Thornton, built from sweat and second chances, was thriving. But even in the wild, wide-open spaces of the West, some ghosts ride fast and relentless. One morning, a telegram arrived from Cheyenne. Jack read it first, silent and still. Then he looked up at Libby with the calm of a man who'd faced down stampedes and storms. "He's coming," he said. Just 3 words. But Libby didn't need more. Dr. Harrison. The name alone was enough to tighten her chest. He was the man who'd tried to take her dignity back in Philadelphia. The one who'd smeared her name after she broke his nose in self-defense. The one who had almost ended her career before it even had a chance to begin. And now, he was riding west. This time, Harrison came dressed in the disguise of official business, armed with paperwork, a federal marshal, and the smug assurance of a man who believed the past could be rewritten to serve his version of the truth. His claim? That Libby was practicing medicine illegally in Wyoming without a valid license. That her so-called hospital was a danger to the community. That she, once again, had no right to call herself a nurse. But the difference now was everything. This wasn't Philadelphia. This wasn't a closed-door boardroom full of old men in polished shoes. This was Wyoming. And Libby was no longer a lone woman fighting back in silence. She had a town behind her. A husband who'd go to war for her if it came to it. And a courtroom ready to hear her side of the story, perhaps. For the first time ever. When Harrison arrived, he brought with him a legal tone, practiced charm, and a thinly veiled sneer. "Mrs. Thornton," he said in front of the townspeople gathered at her hospital. "Or shall I say, Miss Montgomery, I've come to investigate your activities." Libby didn't waver. Not this time. She looked him square in the eye and said calmly, "You're not here to investigate. You're here to discredit. Just like before. Only now I'm not alone." Jack stepped in then, not with fists, but with a demand for a proper hearing. If Harrison wanted to make claims, he'd have to do it in front of a judge and the people. Who knew Libby best? The courthouse in Cheyenne filled to the walls. Ranchers, townsfolk, patients from miles around. People Libby had helped, some she'd saved, came ready to speak. The judge barely had to call for order before the testimonies began. There was the midwife who credited Libby with saving both mother and child during a difficult birth. A ranch hand who'd once been crushed under a wagon, now walking because of her care. The young women who'd trained under her, speaking proudly of their education and futures now filled with purpose. Then came Tom Bradley, the old foreman, tough as nails. He told the story of young Danny, trampled by a horse and barely breathing. "No doctor would have gotten here in time," he said. Miss Libby opened that boy's chest with her bare hands, patched him up, and sat with him till morning. He's alive because of her. When Harrison tried to respond, his past came back to bite. Letters from his former hospital were read. Aloud accounts of negligence, impropriety, and the drinking problem he'd tried to hide. More damning still were the quiet voices of other women, who, emboldened by Libby's courage, finally came forward with their own stories of Harrison's misconduct. The judge listened. And when he gave his verdict, it wasn't just a decision, it was a declaration. "Mrs. Libby Thornton," he said firmly, "this court recognizes your training, your work, and your contribution to the health and welfare of this territory. You are hereby authorized to continue your practice, and your credentials shall be formally recognized under Wyoming law." He turned to Harrison, eyes sharp as flint. "As for you, sir, your conduct disqualifies you from any authority in this territory. I recommend you leave while the good people here still permit you to do so in peace." The gavel came down, and with it, a weight Libby had carried for years lifted. Outside the courthouse, people cheered. Not just for her victory, but for what it meant. That the West wasn't just a land for reinvention, but a place where justice could still be earned. Where women's voices mattered. Where the truth could not be buried by title or power. Jack wrapped his arm around Libby and whispered, "It's over." And Libby, steady as always, simply said, "No, it's just beginning." Because this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about claiming her place. Her past no longer had power over her. She had faced it, spoken it, and won. And from that day forward, everyone knew Libby Thornton wasn't just the nurse who survived a storm. She was the woman who turned justice into history. Some love stories end at "I do." Others after the last kiss under the stars. But a few, rare and enduring, don't really end at all. They grow into something larger. Something that keeps shaping the world long after the first spark fades. Jack and Libby Thornton's story was one of those rare ones. And what they built together in the Wyoming Territory became more than a home, more than a ranch. It became a legacy. By the early 1890s, the Double T Ranch had grown into one of the most respected operations west of the Mississippi. Its pastures stretched further than the eye could see, dotted with horses, cattle, and the kind of workers who called it home. In more ways than one. But what truly made the land special wasn't just the herds or the harvests. It was the heartbeat of the family at its center. Jack and Libby had 3 children. Twin boys born in the winter of 1890, Thomas and Jackson Jr., and a daughter, Rebecca, named with Libby's blessing after Jack's first wife. From the very beginning, the children grew up surrounded by purpose. They saw their mother treat broken bones with steady hands and calm eyes. They watched their father ride into town not to show power, but to listen, to lead, and to protect. Their childhood wasn't about wealth or comfort. It was about meaning. About doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. As they grew, each child followed a different path, but all were rooted in the values they were raised with. Thomas, bold and quick-witted, had his father's gift for leadership. He took to politics not for ego, but out of a deep sense of responsibility. He believed the West deserved a voice, and he became that voice, serving as one of Wyoming's first state senators. His speeches were fiery, but always fair. And folks said he had his mother's fierce sense of justice behind every word. Jackson Jr., quieter than his brother, gravitated toward medicine. He spent his boyhood in the hospital Libby had built, watching her work miracles with little more than linen, willpower, and grit. When he chose to become a doctor, no one was surprised. But when he went on to establish hospitals in remote corners of the territory where people still traveled days for help, everyone agreed. He didn't just carry on his mother's legacy. He expanded it. And then there was Rebecca. Strong, clever, and unafraid to speak her mind. She wasn't drawn to politics or surgery, but to the ranch itself, to the rhythm of the land, the care of animals, the stewardship of something living. She married a rancher like her father, raised 6 children of her own, and ensured the values of the Double T lived on in every fence post, every meal shared under open sky. It was said she rode like a cowboy, healed like a nurse, and led like a Thornton. Meanwhile, the town Jack and Libby had helped shape, Thornton, Wyoming, grew from a dusty outpost into a thriving city. Schools, churches, shops, and homes rose from the plains. The railroad came through, commerce flourished, and at the heart of it all stood the hospital that still bore Libby's name. A place where no one was turned away, where generations of nurses had walked the halls with her spirit echoing in their footsteps. Visitors came from far and wide to see where it had all begun. They toured the original Double T Ranch, now preserved as a piece of history. They stood beneath the cottonwoods Libby loved. They visited the cabin where she once set broken bones by lamplight. And in the Cheyenne Museum, they gazed upon the 2 artifacts displayed side by side, Libby's worn leather medical bag and Jack's wedding ring. But the real legacy wasn't in glass cases. It was in the people who kept showing up. The young nurse who said she'd become a healer because of a story her grandmother told. The rancher who named his daughter Libby. The lawmaker who quoted Jack's letters when drafting new policy for the state. And when the time came, Jack passed first peacefully in 1923. At the age of 86, Libby followed just 3 months later. Some said she couldn't bear life without him. Others believed she simply knew her work was done. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a headstone that read simply, "Forever and always." But their story didn't stop there. Because when a love is lived that deeply, that boldly, it doesn't really die. It becomes legend. And legend, out here in the West, rides on the wind. So maybe the next time you find yourself driving through Wyoming and the sky feels impossibly wide, and you pass a hospital named Thornton or meet someone who still believes in second chances, you'll remember this story. A nurse who was cast out and a cowboy who chose kindness. A partnership that reshaped a town and a love that outlasted time. Jack and Libby didn't just fall in love, they built it. Brick by brick, life by life. And their love made history. There are love stories that touch hearts. And then there are those rare few that root themselves in the soil of a place, take hold, and become legend. Jack and Libby Thornton didn't just build a life together, they built a legacy that the wind still whispers across the Wyoming plains. And when their time on this earth came to an end, the love they left behind was anything but quiet. Jack passed first in the early spring of 1923, 86 years old, silver-haired and steady to the last. He died at home on the Double T Ranch, surrounded by the land he had shaped and the people he had led. For a man who had tamed wild horses and survived prairie storms, his passing was gentle, a final exhale under a sky he had loved his whole life. Just 3 months later, Libby followed. Some say she died of a broken heart. Others say her life had simply completed its full circle. But everyone agreed. She had never intended to stay in a world without him. They were buried side by side on a low hill overlooking the ranch they had built together from nothing. Their children Thomas, Jackson Jr., and Rebecca stood in silence as the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the plains stretched endlessly in every direction. It wasn't just the end of two lives. It was the closing of a chapter that had rewritten what love could mean in the American West. Their headstone is simple, just like them. No grand declarations, no long-winded epitaphs. Just a few words etched in stone, weathered now by time and prairie dust, forever and always, a love that made history. And somehow those words say everything. Because what Jack and Libby created wasn't just a marriage. It wasn't even just a family, a town, or a hospital. It was a movement, quiet, steady, and revolutionary in its own right. A nurse who had once been cast out found not just redemption, but reverence. A cowboy with wealth and power chose to use it not for control, but for compassion. Together, they proved that love isn't always about fireworks. Sometimes it's about showing up every day through hardship and healing, through silence and storms. Their story began with a snowstorm and a wooden bench in Cheyenne. It unfolded in firelight conversations, late-night surgeries, and porch swing promises. And it ended not with tragedy, but with peace, a rare kind of peace earned only by those who lived with intention, grit, and grace. Long after they were gone, people kept coming. Tourists, yes, but also nurses, teachers, ranchers, and dreamers. They came to see the Double T, to visit the hospital Libby built, to walk the streets of the town Jack founded. They came looking for something real in a world that often feels too fast, too loud, too lost. And in the story of Jack and Libby, they found it. Their letters are kept in a museum in Cheyenne. Her medical bag and his wedding ring rest under glass, side by side. But their truest monument isn't made of stone or steel. It's the lives they touched, the generations they inspired. The whispered advice passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. Be brave. Be kind. Be like Libby. In saloons and schools, on front porches and train rides, the tale of Jack and Libby Thornton was told and retold. not as a fairy tale, but as a reminder that love can rise from ruin, that respect is stronger than reputation, and that in the vast, untamed heart of the West, two people once proved that history isn't only shaped by bullets and ballots, it's shaped by love. A love that asked nothing, but gave everything. A love that healed, built, led, and endured. So if you ever find yourself out in Wyoming, and the sky feels a little too big and quiet, and the wind seems to carry a memory you can't quite place, look toward the hills. Toward that small, quiet grave on the ridge where the grass grows. Soft and the sun always lingers just a little longer. That's where Jack and Libby rest, still together, still remembered. Still teaching us in the most enduring way of all, that forever and always isn't just a promise. It's a legacy. In the old American West, people believed in survival more than sentiment. Life was hard. The land was wild. And love? Well, love was often a luxury folks didn't think they could afford. But every once in a while, a story comes along that challenges all of that. One that reminds us that even in the harshest places, among dust storms, broken hearts, and long winters, love not only survives, it thrives. The story of Jack and Libby Thornton wasn't about fairy tale romance. It was about earned love. Love born in the ashes of rejection, resilience, and rebuilding. It's a tale as rugged as the land it came from, and just as beautiful. Libby Montgomery started as a woman with nothing left. Cast out of the life she'd built back east, shamed for telling the truth, and left to survive with only her training and her backbone. When the world slammed its doors in her face, she didn't break, she adapted. She boarded a train west, not with a map or a plan, but with a determination to matter again. That takes a kind of strength most people don't recognize until they see it up close. Then came Jack. On the surface, he had everything: land, wealth, respect. But underneath, he was a man carrying his own losses. A widower. A leader who bore responsibility for dozens of lives. And a heart that had gone quiet after years of grief. He didn't rescue Libby. That's what makes their story different. He recognized her. Saw her not as someone to save, but someone worth standing beside. Their love didn't come easy. It wasn't instant. It was built the way the best things are built, one small steady act at a time, a warm coat in a snowstorm, a cup of coffee by the fire, a job offer that came with dignity instead of pity. And slowly, something extraordinary grew between them, not just romance, but mutual respect, not just passion, but purpose. Libby didn't shrink to fit into Jack's life, she expanded it. As a nurse, she became the lifeblood of the Double T Ranch. As a leader, she built the first hospital in the territory, and a nursing school that trained women who'd never been given a chance before. Her past didn't define her, she defined her future. And Jack? He never tried to tame her fire. He supported it, fanned it, protected it when necessary, but never once tried to control it. He was a man powerful enough to lead and humble enough to listen. Their marriage was a rare dance of equals, a balance that felt ahead of its time, even by today's standards. The beauty of their story isn't just in what they overcame. It's in how they chose each other again and again. Through trials, through public scrutiny, through pain and healing, through the return of enemies and the weight of legacy. They didn't just build a life, they built a community, a town, a movement. And when all was said and done, when they were buried side by side under that wide Wyoming sky, the words carved into their headstone weren't dramatic, they were simple. Forever and always, a love that made history. Because it did. Their love showed us that healing doesn't erase the past, it grows beyond it. That strength isn't about toughness, but tenderness. That true love honors your scars, not despite them, but because of them. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing two people can do is believe in each other when no one else does. So if you've ever been knocked down by life, If you've ever had to start over from scratch, if you've ever wondered if you're too late for a second chance or two, broken to be loved fully, remember Libby, remember Jack, and remember that even in the roughest soil, the strongest roots can take hold. Love, real, lasting, world-changing love begins not in perfection, but in presence, in showing up, in seeing and being seen. That's what happened between a nurse with a shattered past and a cowboy with a quiet heart. And that's why their story still matters, not because they were flawless, but because they were true.